Hey everybody, hope you're enjoying your group time already. Maybe you've already had a chance to have some fellowship or just sit around and talk, chat a little bit, see what God's doing in everybody's life. But now it's time to kind of dig into the study. And we're glad you're here and hoping we can go a little bit deeper from Sunday. Sunday, last weekend, started a brand new series. We're always excited about starting a new series of messages. And this one we're particularly interested in because we're dealing with family life. Well, we're thinking, the month of May, Mother's Day, June, Father's Day right behind it. It's just a good time to focus in on families. And we're convinced that all of our families need some help. If we all had perfect families, we wouldn't have to be having these discussions. But the truth is, I don't know that we have perfect families. We called this series, though, My Perfect Family. A little bit of a spoof on the fact that, indeed, we're not perfect. Not by any stretch. In fact, we're really saying our big idea for this series is that perfect families exist really only in our imagination. Probably everybody has the idea that their family life's going to be perfect one day, but the truth is it doesn't. To help us get to the center of this and to the core of this, we're going to use a biblical character. Because we believe that the Bible is the source of everything in life and has an answer for everything, including families, including life when it gets messy, we're going to turn to the scriptures, and we've chosen a man that some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not. But certainly he demonstrates for us life in a blended family, life in a family that's struggling, life in a family that is far from perfect, and yet somehow in the end he brings the family together and preserves the family and actually doesn't just survive this messy family. He actually thrives. His name is Joseph, all right? His story is found in the ancient book of Genesis, and there's so much to learn. So over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be breaking down some moments in the life of Joseph and see if we can't learn some principles and some precepts that will help us since our families are not perfect. So Sunday, we talked about blended families. Thought that was probably a pretty good place to start because the truth of the matter is all of our families are somewhat affected by blended families. In fact, we're really all the result of a blended family, right? If we have a man who comes from his house, his background, and he marries a woman who comes from her background, immediately we have blended a whole lot of things. And so blended families affect all of us, but particularly blended families are affected by divorce, by remarriage, by children of other with other parents and siblings who are not blood siblings, and really what happens is what is already difficult can become more difficult. So let's just kind of dig in and talk about Sunday's message and talk about these blended families and what we learn from the story of Joseph. Now, probably right here's a good place. You might even want to stop the video, or if you want to listen and then do it later. First of all, I would make sure everybody in the group knows the story of Joseph. Maybe you just need to give a Reader's Digest version, a few major points that you want to center in on and make sure everybody knows. Don't assume that everybody in the group, the person sitting next to you, knows the story of Joseph. It's a well-known story in the Old Testament, but if you're not a Bible student, maybe you don't know. A couple of things to talk about maybe as you think about his Reader's Digest version. Think about this. Joseph's family life was a mess, mainly because his father had children with so many different women, and they were all living together as siblings. And Joseph has this dream and makes his brothers jealous. And talk a little bit about how Joseph was sold into slavery and became a slave in Egypt to the house of Potiphar, a high-ranking official in the Egyptians. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how Joseph found himself in prison. That's a story we'll talk about for sure next week, as a matter of fact. And then how God somehow took Joseph out of that pit and out of that prison and brought great success to his life. He rose to a place of prominence, became second only to the king of Egypt. And then the really cool part of the story that you really need to read is when Joseph's brothers are brought back to Egypt from circumstances that surrounded them, we'll talk about later, when his brothers came back and faced the one that they had thrown into the pit. and how Joseph brought forgiveness and restoration and healing to that family, and the family continued to live in the land of Goshen in the northern part of Egypt. Well, there's the Reader's Digest version. You can take a look at that and see. Now, let's talk about the blended family portion of it. Let's talk about those early days in Joseph's life. We looked at it in Genesis 35. We saw how he had these siblings. We saw how he had these stepmothers and all of these people who were involved. And we saw that it was difficult. What was already difficult becomes more difficult. And so concluding that, we talked about the fact that, probably there are no checklists that we could give you to determine here's how to have your perfect family. As a matter of fact, we thought long and hard about this. Are there any perfect families even in the Bible? What about you? Have you thought about that? Are there any perfect families that you can think about in the Bible? The only one we could think about was Adam and Eve in the very beginning in the Garden of Paradise called Eden. The problem is even their marriage didn't remain perfect. And as it turns out, one of their sons killed the other son, murdered the other son, far from a perfect family. So what was the difference? The stories in Genesis 1 and 2, we learn about this perfect garden paradise and this perfect family. But what happened to make the perfect family imperfect? Hint. Look at Genesis 3. And I think you'll understand quickly that sin entered into the picture. And so ever since, we've had this issue with sin in our families, moving away from God's perfect design, and as a result, our families become a mess. Here's what I want to say to you, though, that I think is very important, a big part of what we're saying in this message. It is impossible, or there are no perfect families, but there are healthy families. And while you may never have your family to be perfect, it can be healthy. So, what steps do you take? Let me quickly give you the things we talked about Sunday, and then you can take each one and maybe expound upon it a little bit more and go further, go deeper, take it to other levels. Here's what we talked about. We talked about the fact that, first of all, it sounds kind of cliche-ish, but it's really true. We've got to make Jesus the Lord of our home, the Lord of our family. That is, give him control. That is, let him be in charge. Let him build the family. Let him build the house. The psalmist said, unless the Lord builds a house, the builders are working in vain. Psalm 127, verse 1. So, talk about that a little bit. Talk about that just in a few moments. How can we make the Lord, or Jesus, the Lord of our families? Talk about how you've done that in your families and where you failed at that. Be honest about that. Maybe you have a thought that will help somebody else. Second, we talked about this. Make teaching your family biblical truths a priority in your home. Now, here's what I firmly believe. Everything you're going to face as a family is dealt with in the Scriptures. Everything. And I know that sounds, you're like, Pastor Eddie, how can that be? No, really, it does. You may have to dig, you may have to search, you may have to do some research, but it's true. So, teach your family biblical truths as a priority. There's truths that will help you, biblical concepts for roles in a marriage between the husband, the wife, the children. There's help for finances. There's help for sibling rivalries. There's help for disciplining children, teaching children to have purpose and meaning. There's help for finding our purpose in life and our goals and our career and on and on. Talk about that. The third thing we said was this. Be sure that your faith is genuine. You can't fake it at home. You can fake your spirituality at church. You can fool the person that's sitting next to you in that circle, but you can't fool your family. Your kids are going to know. Your spouse is going to know. Is this guy, is this gal for real? So live out your faith, your family beyond Sunday by praying together and worshiping together. Not just on Sunday, but throughout the week, but certainly on Sunday. I'm just going to throw in as a sidelight. I know this is going to sound kind of preachery, pastorally, but it's just the truth. Beth and I have found that it's been very important in raising our children and bringing our family to a healthy spot that we are in church on Sunday as a family. Whatever we do on Saturday, we make room for church on Sunday. And then finally, number 4, Don't let cycles of sin keep repeating. The one thing we see in Joseph's family and really throughout Scripture is that cycles of sin tend to repeat down to the next generation, the next generation, the next generation. Be the one to stop that. Decide that I'm going to stop that cycle of sin. Whatever's plaguing my family, whatever it is that's keeping my family, maybe it's an addiction, and this addiction, whether it's drugs, whether it's alcohol, whether it's pornography, whatever you may be addicted to, if it's splitting your family, if it's causing tensions in your family, be the one to decide to stop that. You say, well, my dad did that. Well, my mom did that. Well, stop it. Make a decision to break the cycle. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that in your circle. What does that look like? But here's our takeaway, and I want to leave you with this. Never give up on your family. Your family's too valuable. Your family's too important. Your family is ordained of God. God has given you that family. He's built you to live in community, and that community starts with Him and then goes to family. So never give up on your family. Remember, there are no perfect families, but there are healthy families. All right, I've given you a lot to talk about. So maybe now you want to shut off the TV, the screen, the computer, whatever you're viewing, and just engage that circle, and you guys talk it out. Can't wait for next week, and it's going to be exciting. Until then, God bless you, and have fun.